I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Zachary Kallenborn, a policy fellow in the Center for Security Policy Studies at George Mason University and a research affiliate in unconventional weapons and technology at START. Zachary has an MA in Nonproliferation and Terrorism Studies from Middlebury Institute of International Studies and a BS in Mathematics and International Relations from the University of Puget Sound. His work has been featured in numerous international media outlets, including the New York Times, Slate, NPR, Forbes, New Scientist, Wired, Foreign Policy, the BBC, and many others. So, Zach, welcome back. Today, we're talking about the DoD's new Replicator Initiative that was announced recently by Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks during the National Defense Industrial Association's Emerging Technology Expo. So Replicator seeks to counter China's quote-unquote strength in numbers by producing multiple thousands of attributable autonomous systems across multiple domains within 2 years. So in other words, I think one of the takeaways is they're talking about mass-produced, low-cost military drones, but that's not the entire story. This is a brand new initiative. So let me start out by asking, what do you know about this and what are your initial opinions?
Yeah, so initially, I think the program is quite interesting. It's obvious that, the department has learned the lesson of Ukraine that having these sort of cheap unmanned systems can be really, really important. I think some of the timelines are somewhat ambitious that they're going to get these in 2 years. That is the actual building of the technology. I think, yeah, that's certainly doable within 2 years. The problem is sort of the bureaucracy that goes around it, building out the requirements. For example, when Deputy Hicks, Secretary Hicks, announced the program, she also noted like several requirements putting on it. And that also means test and evaluation and other things that go beyond it. So from a technological perspective, I think it's doable. But from a bureaucratic, I'm a little bit less sure. That said, I think part of the point is more to sort of galvanize the department and the broader industry to look at like how can we do these things faster and figure out, okay, if we don't make it in 2 years, where are those real choke points? And then you sort of use the status of this very high level senior office to say like, all right, we got to fix these things. We see A, B, and C as the problem. Let's go out and do them. That type of thing. So overall, I think it's an interesting approach. We'll be curious to see how it unfolds.
So let's touch on China's strength in numbers for a moment. China has 348 naval warships. We have 296. They have 2 million service members. We have 1.4 million. However, they only have 4,000 military aircraft. We have over 13,000. So in terms of numbers, they have a naval and troop strength advantage, but they remain far behind us in terms of air power. And from what I understand, they're not as advanced as we are technologically. So in terms of parity, would you say that the Replicator Initiative is about catching up or about staying ahead?
I would say it's more about staying ahead, particularly over a protracted conflict. One thing that we've seen in Ukraine is that although drones were quite significant, they also churned through them very significantly. There's a recent RUSI report that estimated Ukraine is losing something like 10,000 drones every month. And that's kind of where I see the value here. I mean, numbers are important, but they're only important so far. That technology definitely matters, but so does the experience and training that the United States has had, fighting nonstop wars for the past 20 or so years. That's important. And then, of course, there's sort of the question of interest, and particularly how much is the United States being willing to accept cost there, and how much is China willing to do so. And so I see it, it's connected with all of those things, looking at like, okay, how do we build cheap mass over time? Because in a long conflict, we're probably going to lose some of those systems. We may be more effective, and we may lose them at slower rates, but we're going to lose some. So, I see it as that role about continuing to sort of maintain capability and mass over time.
Okay. Well, so another point worth bringing up is that the US has over 800 bases around the globe and China doesn't. And that's something that I've kept reading about and people saying, well, basically, pundits and experts have said that really matters. That plays a big role. So, oh,
Yeah, I think it matters to a degree in terms of general like global influence. Yes, that absolutely matters. But if you look at a conflict between China and the United States, almost certainly it's going to be in over Taiwan, and where it's United States absolutely needs that power projection because the biggest issue we're going to have is that we have to send forces over the Pacific Ocean. By contrast, China doesn't. They're pretty close to one another. And so, sure, China may have less power projection capabilities in general, but in that particular conflict, it probably doesn't actually matter all that much. That said, it does matter a little bit because they have to move it over the strait and to get it to the actual island itself. But that's a much smaller lift than, say, projecting power to the other side of the globe.
Ah, okay. Well, so Replicator isn't completely about drones. Hicks has said that it's about overcoming the quote unquote production valley of death and about driving culture change just as much as technological change. And it's about replicating best practices as much as products. So, if I understand things correctly, Replicator is a process for accelerating the acquisition and procurement of new tech with drones and autonomy as the initial focus. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah, I believe so. I think, yeah, as alluded to in my opening comments, part of the challenge, like the bureaucratic system of the United States for military procurement, is incredibly slow, especially with some of these emerging technologies. I've already mentioned Ukraine. One of the other examples is, how we procure software, where it may take several years for the Department of Defense to procure some just commercial off-the-shelf software because of the amount of sort of requirements and testing process and verification process that need to happen. Now, some of that makes sense. A typical user like you or I isn't going to have the same sort of security and system level issues that a military person is. So like some of that makes sense, but it's still very much a long period of time to actually do that. So putting a concerted effort at like, okay, how do we do these things faster? I think and having it at that high level is very important, because if we're in a wartime scenario, we have to make it that fast. We may not be able to have 2 to 3 years to revise these processes, develop these systems, because war fighters are on the ground getting killed, today. And so I think that's a huge part of that, of sort of figuring out where the real issues are and then using the sort of power of position to draw attention to those issues.
In terms of drones, I want to focus in on this a little bit. It's a rapidly evolving and diversifying area of technology. There is so much change right now. So, traditionally speaking, we've relied on the Predator and drones that are built basically like light aircraft, whereas Russia is using kamikaze drones that are similar in some ways to V-1 buzz bombs. And the Ukrainians are fielding quadcopters and model aircraft sized devices. In terms of China, though, what kind of size and range of drones do you expect to see us using?
Potentially the full scope. The issue you run into with using like a predator type system in a conflict like that is they'll just potentially get shot down. That said, I don't think we can treat that as an assumption, at least early on in the conflict. One of the things that we saw in the Ukraine-Russia conflict is that early on, Russia was not really doing a very good job of really even following its own air defense standard operating procedures, not providing support for critical logistics systems and other types of, convoys and stuff like that. And so early on, the Bayraktar TB2 is actually very successful. Wasn't as successful as it has been in other conflicts, but it tallied up quite a few kills with very few losses. That said, over time, Russia kind of figured out, oh, we need to do a better job of this and improve that capability. That said, I think also smaller drones are likely to play a critical role as well. I think one of the places that the United States sees those systems as being really useful is sort of popping the air defense bubble, using these cheap attritable systems to overwhelm Chinese air defenses and then destroying them, because the loss of a couple of drones isn't a big deal. Loss of an F-35 and F-22, those are going to be expensive, and of course you have the loss of life. So, I think some of those smaller drones in the short term could be useful there. I also see the United States increasingly use unmanned surface vehicles as well as unmanned undersea vehicles, because similarly, they're significantly cheaper than many of the systems that we have. Getting a new F-35, a new F-22, or I should say in that case, a new destroyer or certainly a new carrier takes years, if not decades. But if you can use a bunch of cheap unmanned systems that you can sort of throw at an adversary to deplete their defenses and do some damage, that can be really effective. So I think we potentially see the full scope of all of these capabilities. Maybe not so much ground, at least on the United States side, only because like a U.S. conflict with China is probably going to look mostly like a naval and aerial conflict with potentially some ground elements, especially some amphibious operations, either getting into China getting into Taiwan and countering that, or potentially the United States being more aggressive and trying to put some land forces on China, just purely to place pressure.
Well, and I was going to ask about that because there's, well, so you'd mentioned naval, right? And so the Ukrainian drone navy is something that is completely new that's emerging in warfare. And then we also have lots and lots of aerial drones, which I think when people think drones, they think of aircraft, quadcopters, things like that. And then the US military is developing basically land-based drones. And I've seen all sorts
Mhm.
of kind of miniature tank looking drones, as well as I think that they're looking at autonomy for transportation at some point, right? So there's a
Mhm.
lot there that could be fielded. But as you mentioned, in terms of China, you're talking about naval and air mostly, right?
Mhm. Yeah, that's my inclination, and I think naval could have some pretty important roles there. And one of my the first article I wrote around drones in general was looking at sort of the idea of a drone swarm operating under the sea as potentially sort of a future capital ship, where you have like these drones kind of searching the ocean, looking for destroying things. And I think the idea of sort of like those smart mobile sea mines, and states are increasingly looking at. I think Turkey just showed a prototype recently. I believe some of that's a little bit more, not far future, but more like, decade away from now, as opposed to like, if conflict goes off tomorrow, is it going to be a critical capability? But I think things like that can be really useful because although China is relatively close, it still has that strait in the way. So being able to kind of choke that up and make it harder for China to use send landing forces onto Taiwan, I think could be very important, as well as no doubt, there's going to be a major naval component when it comes to logistics and supply, where I think both surface drones could be useful as supply, but also protecting supplies as well. Because no doubt China recognizes that, there's that huge ocean that the United States has to cross. So if you try to disrupt or destroy things, well in the middle of the ocean, you can potentially create much greater harms and prevent some of those supplies and other assets from making it to the actual battlefield itself. So using unmanned surface vehicles and unmanned undersea vehicles to both carry out attacks, as well as provide greater line of sight in ISR. You could even imagine like a manned logistics boat system using some of these unmanned surface vehicles as sort of like a small reconnaissance or something to extend line of sight into other areas. So I think there's potentially a broad array of uses that you can use for these for unmanned surface systems.
How do you see US replicator drones using autonomy? This is an
Mhm.
area where you have a lot of subject expertise and like just a lot of research that you've put into it. So do you see this as being for independent fighting, like maybe like a cruise missile, or for
Mhm.
weapons support for manned aircraft like the Loyal Wingman program, or as swarms of AI drones working together, either maybe under the direct control of a human operator who's directing the swarm, or maybe completely computer
Mhm.
controlled?
So I think it'll be more like cruise missiles or swarms of AI working together. The department has been very interested in sort of those loyal wingman type programs, but then they've been doing that for a number of years. But those tend to be much larger timelines, I think, than the type of program that you're looking at here, which makes sense because, with a loyal wingman, it's not just a drone operating on its own. But it has to work in collaboration, coordination with a human pilot. So you need all of the capabilities to do that collaboration work together, which entails a little bit more difficulty. But I think for these, I think you can expect to see some level of basic autonomy, basic navigation and movement, that type of thing.
Okay. Well, since we touched on autonomy, I also want to ask about jamming, right? Because I think that these kind of go hand in hand. So the Ukrainians claim to be having a lot of success jamming Russian kamikaze drones. I want to ask if you see if that is going to be an issue with China. I mean, China seems like it's maybe more able to implement jamming at scale, right? Compared to Ukraine, which lacks space or airborne capabilities to really broadcast large
Mhm.
signals. That's kind of my thought, I guess. I don't know how
Yeah.
accurate that might be.
Yeah, so I'll say that's a little bit beyond my expertise, providing like direct comparison between Ukraine and China. But that said, certainly China is taking the issue of jamming very seriously. I think one of the things that China has done that's very interesting is the creation of their strategic support force, where they basically combine cyber, electronic warfare, space, all together, and I think information operations as well, into a single major unit. And interestingly, that unit actually also happens to get a significant amount of the AI budget that goes to the Chinese military. So it's obvious that they recognize that. And it's quite clear that they recognize that a critical component of how the United States fights is by the command and control linkages between different units, which requires that communication. So jamming there is not only for actual drone itself, but also to get inside the United American decision loop, as it were. Just make it harder to collaborate between different types of units, and make it harder to share information, make it harder to share decisions or make decisions. So I think absolutely that jamming issue is going to be quite significant and quite serious. That said, there's potential counters to that, from trying to find and targeting those jamming capabilities to various electronic defensive and protection measures, like, just increasing the power on signals, that type of thing.
Well, the reason I asked about jamming was it seems like that may push things towards full autonomy. And
Mhm.
there have been, over the last several years, there have been repeated, assurances from Western military leaders that autonomous systems will never have the decision to fire without a human in the loop. But, at best, this adds a delay in combat response time. And at worst, it renders them susceptible to jamming, right? So I'm wondering if Replicator may push us over the hump into completely autonomous weapon systems that are able to fire on their own and thus avoid the jamming issue entirely.
I think that's possible, and I think that is a big part of the rationale why folks are interested in autonomy, is because they said, like, if you don't have a signal there to jam, then it's not necessarily a big deal. But I do think there is concern over that ethical dimension, and the reliability that comes along with it, of how prone are these systems to error. Like, sure, you might get the benefit of overcoming jamming, but if you also are, making more mistakes, one of the things that we've seen is a single pixel change is enough to cause a machine vision system to confuse a stealth bomber for a dog. Now that's in a particularly controlled setting, but we know in actual military conflicts, there's all sorts of stuff going all over the place, and it's chaotic, and mistakes are normal in the best of times, and certainly machine doesn't have the same systems. So how do those sort of benefits and risks stack up, I think, is an open question, and I think it'll probably depend a lot on sort of the scale and success of those test evaluation measures, as well as how, like, the test evaluations work actually play out in the real world scenario, because tests are fairly controlled, they're based on what people can foresee, but actual reality is different. That said, it's not strike me that you necessarily need full autonomy. That is because, jamming isn't like a kinetic destructor. Like, you don't just like jam it once and then, all right, you're done. It's now completely neutralized. Jamming requires those signals to be continuously monitored and continuously overwhelmed. So even if you have basically an entirely autonomous system, with the exception of that fire decision, which, if we're talking about a kamikaze type system, you only need to make once, then you have to be jamming specifically at that moment when you get the fire decision, which means if that system can find like a couple seconds, say by shifting to a different frequency where you have signals coming through, where a fire signal can come through, that may very well be enough. Now, how effective that works in practice is also, of course, a critical question. But I don't think we should assume that full autonomy is necessary to get some of
Mhm.
these benefits. You could have 99.9% autonomy and just leave that single fire decision up to the human, where you would reduce significantly those risks and may still have the benefits of overcoming a lot of jamming.
Well, I want to get briefly into cost as well. And I did a lot of research on this, but I think one of the best examples is the F-35 Lightning II Joint Strike Fighter program. So the Government Accounting Office just published that it may cost nearly 1.7 trillion to buy, operate, and sustain the aircraft and systems over its lifetime. That's, I believe, the entire program cost. And
Mhm.
if I understand correctly, the cost of each aircraft, it's come down slightly, but I believe it's hovering something around 80 million per aircraft. So in contrast to that, Russia's Lancet drones cost $35,000 each. Ukraine just unveiled a new $3,500 cardboard Corvo drone. They basically, it's like an IKEA thing. You put it together yourself. It carries like a 6-pound payload, and obviously, neither one of these are comparable to the F-35, But for the same price as an F-35, we could purchase over 2,200 Lancets or over 22,000 Corvos. So I'm wondering if these price comparisons mark a turning point towards smaller, cheaper weapon systems.
I think there's a shift, but I think there's always going to be limits, and I think in reality, they're like the cheap systems will operate in conjunction and in support to some of these more expensive systems. That is, because the roles are somewhat different. Part of the reason why we want these cheap attritable systems is sort of wipe out some of those air defenses. But once one of those air defenses are wiped out, then you can accept greater risk in some of these higher end systems that can do all sorts of amazing things that you can't do with an IKEA made drone. But I do think there is a real interest, and that'll be an important one to see, particularly when you look at sort of the fights between these cheap systems and like the F-35 and that sort of thing. Like if we talk about air to air fight, an F-35 we can expect to just mop the floor with some of these systems. But if we're talking about even some of these like higher end military drones, how exactly will they operate sort of in the future, particularly given their much lower cost equation and their fact that they're attritable, because if they're, let's imagine that, like, I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but let's say that like the Reaper is I think like a third to a quarter of the price of like an F-35 or a Reaper-like system, because probably an F-35 is not fighting a Reaper. But if you lose, say, two Reapers, but then two of the other two manage to take out the F-35, that's still a net cost advantage, right?
Yeah.
Because then those Reapers can go on and do other things. And you can imagine, Chinese and Russia drones trying to do similar type things. And so I don't think we're there yet to that type of like level of air-to-air combat between sort of drones and some of these manned craft. But over time, I think we will be, as we saw in the recent Department of Defense test where they had the simulated F-16 versus AI pilot, where the AI pilot wiped the floor with the real-world F-16 pilot. And that's F-16s, and that's just a simulated test. That's not real world. There's a bunch of caveats there, but at least it is plausible over time that some of these cheaper systems become as, if not more effective than some of these drones. And of course, it's not only air-to-air combat, because at least potentially you have some of these drones being used for more like air-to-ground type activities to hit the aircraft, not when they're on the flying about, but when they're actually like on the runway or in these bases. And we've seen a couple cases of that in Russia, where folks were using like literally these tiny quadcopters, and they just like sat it on top of, I think it was like a Russian AWACS or like an early warning type aircraft, like a pretty important strategic defense aircraft, and they just like flew a quadcopter and put it on there. That said, that implies that you have support systems in close enough range to those planes, because those commercial systems, while cheap, they're also relatively small range. So you need someone relatively close by, which means special operators, intelligence, that type of thing, doing somewhat more exotic infiltration things, which is a little bit different than the actual cost of the drone itself.
Okay. Well, the other part of this that I want to touch on is, I guess, the human cost. So, National Defense Magazine wrote that the average cost per active duty service member is close to $140,000. I believe that's per year, and that is in 2021 dollars, right? We've had a little bit of inflation since then. And that highlights another benefit of drones. You're saving on the costs of salary, housing, deployment costs, medical expenses, and all of the other expenses and costs that apply to each member of the armed services, especially when they are deployed in an active combat situation, right? So, I mean, not only would this apply to combat personnel, but autonomy might provide savings for this. For again, like for C-130 transport aircraft, if you're able to apply autonomy to that, potentially land vehicle transport, right? If you have convoys that are able to drive themselves, the idea is that maybe the US would be able to forge a smaller, higher trained expert military built around this technology and have a net cost savings by simply having fewer personnel who are more highly trained.
Yeah, I think there'll be some of that, but I would hesitate to go too far, because I think, first of all, I think war is fundamentally about and will always be about human beings. We go to war because we want humans to do something or stop doing something. Like that's the only reason we fight in the first place. And so being able to impose costs will always be about inflicting costs on human lives, even if we kind of have to go through the robots to get into that. And likewise, I think we shouldn't overstate, even with autonomy, the removal of people. Although I think, yes, you will have some reduction. The reality is you're still going to have other support systems that go along with it. So if we talk about like the Reaper, like, okay, yes, you have that pilot that's there, but for one, you still need a pilot to actually do that. Even if it's not in the cockpit, you need someone to actually maneuver it. So if some of these systems are remotely piloted rather than fully autonomous, you're still going to have that pilot doing all of those things. But you also still have all of the support and other activities that come along with it. Even autonomous C-130 needs to be maintained, needs to be supported. You need someone watching it, you need someone eventually monitoring some of those sensors, seeing what's going on. So I think might be some reduction, but it might, rather than like be a big reduction in total personnel, it might just shift those personnel away from being less on the transport to serving other potential functions. So in that respect, I do think there is some significance, but I think we also have to think about sort of the second and third order effects that come along with some of that movement reduction. Because as I said, like, war is ultimately about inflicting costs on people. So then the potential strategy and how we think about our approach to warfare shifts as well, to figure out where the people are and go and target and blow them up. And that's something we've increasingly seen in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, where both sides are realizing that, what, I can just keep shooting down these $1,000 or whatever drones, or I could actually go after the people who are operating those drones, because those people need to be trained. Those are actually someone's, son, daughter, cousin, brother, sister, et cetera. And it's a lot more costly to get rid of those people, assuming that you can find them. So, there may be some of those shifts in how we think about and how we do targeting and strategy.
Uh, Zach, let me thank you so much for your time today. And I want to close by asking what you anticipate seeing in the headlines in the next few months for drones and the Replicator Initiative, as well as what is coming up for you. What are your plans and your engagements over the next few months?
Yeah, well, so I got a lot going on, but I'll start with the first one, sort of headlines. I think, we're going to continue to see more and more information come out, certainly out of Ukraine and Russia, as folks adapt and evolve. I think one of the ones that I'm going to be interested to see is whether we see a greater return to the Bayraktar onto combat. I believe I said earlier, we saw a lot of the Bayraktar early on, but as Russia got better at air defense, we saw less and less of it. But Ukraine has also been targeting and destroying some of Russian air defense. So we might see sort of a greater return there, which could be interesting, where we get sort of like this little loop-de-loop there and sort of the role there. In terms of the replicator specifically, I think, certainly you're going to have to put out like RFIs, RFPs, I should say requests for information, requests for proposals, to basically start acquiring some of these drones. They're going to have to figure out, like, okay, which systems are we going to actually use? Are they going to look at systems that sort of have kind of already been built and just kind of scaling them? Or are they going to have to like totally design some, new autonomous system? Certainly doing a system that's there already will be relatively affordable, and probably will be greater on the sort of the testing and evaluation sort of spectrum. But if the goal is to get it cheaper, you may have to just create something new. So I think that's what we can expect to sort of see, at least from this program. And I think we can also expect to see global militaries take a close look at Ukraine and Russia conflict about these systems and try to learn their own lessons. Maybe they'll have their own replicator program or something similar. Because there's very clearly a lot of folks already paying attention to what's happening in drone warfare, because it's a lot changing, and I think no one really knows where it's headed over the long term.
Mm.
In terms of what I'm doing, a few things. So I've finished up a study on drone countermeasures that I'm working, hopefully getting out soon at Joint Force Quarterly. But there's been some editorial issues on their end that we've been trying to work through, or I should say system issues rather. Also doing some work on UAV forensics, trying to figure out like both what is it, as well as why does it matter to national security and global security, and like how can we do that better at sort of a global policy type thing. I'm also interested on less of the drone side. I've been expanding a little bit on the work I did around existential terrorism. I'm interested in sort of existential spoilers writ large. Like, as there's been this increasing focus on existential risk, what happens when folks, decide to stand in the way from that? Not just terrorists, but, what happens if Sam Altman or someone at like OpenAI or Google is like, hey, I want to build an ASI. I don't really care that much if it kills everyone because that's the next stage in humanity, which was a quote from one of the Google founders the other day. So what if someone sort of stands in the way of some of these restriction measures? Why would they do that? What are the ways that they can do that? I think that's really interesting. Let's see, beyond that, I also have some work going on around tripolar nuclear deterrence and sort of what is that, how do we need to change our way of thinking about nuclear deterrence, where we've primarily been thinking about it in terms of like US Russia relationships over the past several decades, but like how is it different or the same with sort of China potentially growing their nuclear capabilities and at least plausibly reaching parity over the next several decades. So got a lot going on and a handful of other projects at early stages that I could probably take up the next 15 minutes talking about.
Very, very busy. Zach, let me thank you so much for your time today, sir.
Yeah, and thank you for having me.